Hi folks, we're back and this is Cutting Through the Matrix. You know, it's not too difficult to do your own searches and your own studies to find out that big players, big organizations run the world. And these organizations are above your governments and they're within your governments because they do have their so-called scientists placed on board with them, especially now. It's a fairly recent phenomenon to have all these scientists placed on panels within governments who then advise presidents and prime ministers supposedly what to do. They all know it's an inside joke because they're there to make sure the agenda, there's only one agenda, is carried forward. And you can find the agenda, again, going all the way back to very old authors who talked about depopulation and getting rid of the unfit and all of that kind of stuff in a world to come. And Thomas Malthus, of course, was one of the main characters shoved forth into history to start off the conversations amongst the wealthy about this and about the coming problems of shortages and sustainability and all the rest of it. This is where all this comes from. And it's no coincidence that the big foundations today that have carried on through Rockefeller and other ones are promoting the exact same agendas. But they also give us cognitive dissonance, as they call it, because we are trained to believe that charitable foundations and people who want to help us are there to help us. And when you also read that the same people are involved in depopulation, we go into a sort of click mode. We can't compute the two. Is he here to help me or is he here to kill me? And literally we tend to go for the better judgment, the nicer judgment, I should say. It's actually the wrong judgment, but the nicer one, the one that doesn't upset us too much because we've been trained to be sort of egocentric and we don't like to look at the bad things. And then you get into eugenics and modern times and so on. And you're going to understand it's truly, truly with you in a big, big way. And the articles I'm going to read, I'm going to put up tonight on my site, cuttingthroughthematrix.com, put the links up for you to look up for yourself. Well worth keeping a hold of too. Download them because things disappear so rapidly now from the internet. And this says here, they mention the people who are involved in eugenics, the political left as well as the political right in modern times. It says, note the stunning statements below by people like Bertrand Russell and George Bernard Shaw, or those by Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood. Planned Parenthood is simply abortion across the world. I noticed recently they've got an incredible budget now, and they're going across the world in a big time to sterilize and abort children because she's the one who called them weeds, you see. If they don't have a function in society, if they're from the lower strata, they're called weeds. For the women and feminists who didn't know who the great hero happened to be, great lover of Hitler and Stalin too, by the way. But Malthus is the guy who first came out with the writings on could the earth sustain a certain population. He was wrong on all accounts, of course. In fact, about 50 years after he finished his book, he predicted we'd be standing about 5 deep on top of each other, and that didn't happen either. But he also called for the elimination of the poor, and he was all in favor of advocating poorhouses and sort of housing complexes in the most disgusting and disease-ridden areas where the people would die off much faster. So it's quite interesting to read the letters between himself and others, and then, of course, those who came after him in the same, I call them same societies because they all belong to the same societies. And by the way, these characters were all specially bred themselves. They were inbred, just like the Darwin family. This movement's been on the go for an awful, awful long time, right? Even all the way back to Plato. And before him, I'm sure. But it says here, Charles Darwin agrees with Francis Galton's eugenic ideas. Now, the Galton family eventually bred into the Darwin family as well. Up until then, the Darwins had only inbred with the Wedgwood family for generations. But he agrees with them. You'll see that in the first letter there. He agrees. This is the personal letters between the two of them with their eugenics ideas and so on and depopulation. And then Charles Darwin, in The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex, in his second edition says this, It says, with savages, the weak in body or mind are soon eliminated, and those that survive commonly exhibit a vigorous state of health. In other words, disease and the whole bit is good. Those who survive are the healthiest. We civilized men, on the other hand, do our utmost to check the process of elimination. We build asylums for the imbeciles, the maimed and the sick. We institute poor laws, and our medical men exert the most utmost skill to save the life of everyone to the last moment. There is reason to believe that vaccination has preserved thousands who, from a weak constitution, would formerly have succumbed to smallpox. Thus the weak members of civilized societies propagate their kind. No one who has attended to the breeding of domestic animals will doubt that this must be highly injurious to the race of man. It's hardly surprising how soon a want of care, or care wrongly directed, leads to the degeneration of a domestic race. But excepting in the case of man himself, hardly anyone is so ignorant as to allow his worst animals to breed. He says, the aid which we feel impelled to give to the helpless is mainly an incidental result of the instinct of sympathy, which was originally acquired as part of the instincts, but subsequently rendered, in the manner previously indicated, more tender and more widely diffused. Nor could we check our sympathy even at the urging of hard reason without deterioration in the noblest part of our nature. The surgeon may harden himself while performing an operation, for he knows that he is acting for the good of his patient. But if we were intentionally to neglect the weak and helpless, it could only be for a contingent benefit with an overwhelming present evil. We must therefore bear the undoubtedly bad effects of the weak surviving and propagating their kind. But there appears to be at least one check in steady action, namely that the weaker and inferior members of society do not marry so freely as the sound, and this check might be indefinitely increased by the weak in body or mind refraining from marriage. By the way, that was part of the plans they discussed a long time ago at the Department of Population, it's really Population Control at United Nations, when they talked about fast takedowns in some countries by introducing disease. Well, bingo, you have a specific type of AIDS in Africa, very fast takedown. In the West, they decided that disabling diseases that would make them ineligible for marriage would be used as your crippling diseases and chronic fatigue. Back with more after this. Hi folks, we're back and we're cutting through the matrix, just reading some quotes that the big boys put out in the past. Remember that Darwinism and the whole idea of natural selection and the betterment of the race, as I like to call it, is part of academia. It's all to do with evolution. You must believe in evolution if you go into the universities in this day and age. It's a must be. You've got to believe in it. And along with all of that comes all of this as well that I've just been reading here, because this is what's all based upon: survival of the proper kind of humanity and not the lesser kind, you see. And they want to get rid of the weak, disabled, and so on. And that's what the whole ecological movement is based upon. Sustainability, etc., is a cover for this particular program, which has been so well documented by themselves and is taught in academia, of course, and is kept out of the general mainstream, at least in its more hard and straightforward form. This is also what Charles Darwin says here: elimination of the poorly endowed in advanced society. Great lawgivers and founders of beneficent religions, great philosophers and discoverers in science aid the progress of mankind in a far higher degree by their works than by leaving a numerous progeny. In the case of corporeal structures, it is the selection of the slightly better endowed and the elimination of the slightly less well endowed individuals, and not the preservation of strongly marked and rare anomalies, that leads to the advancement of a species. So it will be with the intellectual facilities, since the somewhat abler men in each grade of society succeed rather better than the less able, and consequently increase in number, if not otherwise prevented. When in any nation the standard of intellect and the number of intellectual men have increased, we may expect from the law of the deviation from an average that prodigies of genius will, as shown by Mr. Galton, appear somewhat more frequently than before. You're going to understand too, this is where the whole idea came from for books, novels like The Handmaid's Tale and so on, when they talk about actually special breeding, selecting special women for breeding. And by the way, they'd already been doing it back in the 1700s. And Benjamin Franklin kind of touched on that in one of his letters, since he was a member of one of those clubs. But it's a very good site. Margaret Sanger, all her cases are in it, all her quotes and so on. And this is one of her quotes from Sanger for the feminists out there. Every single case of inherited defect, every malformed child, every congenitally tainted human being brought into this world is of infinite importance to that poor individual, but is of scarcely less importance to the rest of us and to all our children who must pay in one way or another for these biological and racial mistakes. And Sanger also praised eugenics. His degeneration has already begun. Eugenicists demonstrate that 2/3 of our manhood of military age are physically too unfit to shoulder a rifle, that the feeble-minded, the syphilitic, the irresponsible, and the defective breed unhindered, and the vicious cycle of mental and physical defect, delinquency, and beggary is encouraged by the unseeing and unthinking sentimentality of our age to populate asylums, hospital, and prison. All these things that the eugenicist sees and points out with a courage entirely admirable. So she was completely all for it. She was also for sterilization of what she called the feeble-minded. And the U.S. tends to forget that the Rockefeller boys and Cold Spring Harbor went into sterilization right up into the 1970s in the United States by simple court orders. And many people are suing now because they were sterilized by these court orders and classified as retarded, defective, simply not good enough to have progeny. And they also talk about birth control eventually being made mandatory, etc. But of course for that, what they did was bring in people like Bernays, who thought of other ways to do it. If you can't get what you want with society, what you do is you change society, and then they'll accept what you want. You make them think it's all for themselves, and they went to work creating the pill, and then saying, go ahead and have fun. Exactly what Julian Huxley also talks about. He says they'll be able to basically have as much sex as they want as long as they don't actually breed. That was the only stipulation. And that's what you've got today, the outcome of a big war going on that most folk are utterly ignorant of. And a lot of them are quite enjoying it at the moment as well. But in the book, The Next Million Years, a descendant of Galton and the Darwins is Charles Galton Darwin. And he was a physicist. He worked on the Manhattan Project because all these families are into mass killing. And he was all for the atom bomb. He worked on the bomb project. And he wrote a book too in the 1950s called The Next Million Years. But in the book I noticed too, as I was perusing it again for the umpteenth time there, a little quote. And he said that eventually he was talking about aging, creating life extension for those who have the best brains, the better breeding. And so they'd be relatively old and obviously wouldn't get partners. So he mentioned the fact that they would bring it in a form of pedophilia, and they make pedophilia normal so that the wealthy rich could still breed and pass on their genes. Interesting, isn't it? That's all over the media today as they push what they call intergenerational sex. And it's all in a whole bunch of Hollywood movies too. That's where you get most of your indoctrination. He then goes on to talk about in his book, Charles Galton Darwin, about how they breed racehorses. And he talks about how they slaughter the ones that finish last, etc. Then advises them they should really do the same thing with, humans, Back with more after this.